Viewer discretion is advised.
Dear students and teacher, welcome to the Professor Sharing Events, Relationship between Israel and Palestine, organized by ISA. I'm 𝐴𝐸𝐫, a year 3 student from Malaysia, your MC of today's event. Before we start, please allow me to introduce our speaker of tonight, Professor Glenn Timmermans. It is our great honor to have you here. Professor Timmermans is a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain. He is the founding directors and active board members of the Hong Kong Holocaust and Tolerance Centers and the program director of International Center for Jewish Studies in London. Professor Timmermans has a great interest in the Holocaust studies, especially in teaching Holocaust history and the Holocaust education in Asia. He introduced and teaches the course, the Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights, as part of our UNI's GE program, and I believe some of our participants here have been spending a great time with Professor Timmermans before. He is also the founder and principal organizer of the annual 𝐿𝐸𝐫𝐵 Holocaust Seminar for Chinese educators. He is active in raising awareness of the Holocaust and other genocides, and is also a highly respected scholar in the field of Jewish history. Today, Professor Timmermans will bring us through the history of Israel again and guide us in understanding the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Welcome, Professor Timmermans.
𝐴𝐸𝐫, thank you very much. Much appreciated for your kind words and for you and Isuru and Marissa for inviting me to do this. So thank you. I did speak to some students about a year ago on the topic, but maybe not in as much detail as we will tonight. About a month ago, Marissa asked me to be a guest speaker, which was very kind of her. And then she suggested this topic, which I immediately agreed to. And then afterwards, I thought, bloody hell, why did I agree to that? Because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it would actually have been easier if you'd asked me to explain the meaning of life or the origins of the universe, or does God exist? Because the topic tonight is an extremely complicated topic. It really is one of those subjects which we can discuss over and over and over, and we're probably never going to reach a conclusion. First of all, it's very nice to see a great many names that I recognize. We'd love to see your faces at some point. Maybe when we get to the Q&A, you'll turn your cameras on. I recognize many names on the list, and it's really lovely to see students from quite a few years ago, and also even some current students. So that's delightful to welcome you all. What I want to say before we begin, I'm going to do my absolute best. I probably won't succeed, but I'm going to do my best to be as neutral as possible on this subject. Clearly, I have my own very strong feelings and points of view on the subject, but I think it's very important that I do my best to try and present both sides equally, even though obviously everybody has their own point of view, and I honestly doubt if there's anyone who is completely neutral about the subject, but I will do my best to be as neutral as I can be. So I've called the talk Mission Impossible, because that's really what it is. Whether one can ever reach an amicable solution between Israel and Palestine is a very moot question. And you might notice, we will look at this in detail later, but you might notice the background to the slides I'm going to be using in this talk is this picture of the Western Wall in Jerusalem, and over here is the Dome of the Rock. And in many ways, this encapsulates much of the problem. Obviously, the question is much bigger than just this area of Jerusalem, but in many ways, this particular site, the background to the slide, is at the nub of the conflict. Now, how do I get this to move? Oh yeah, I'm so proud of now having done a PowerPoint. Now I can't get the damn thing to move. What do I need to do to move the thing? Why is it not moving? What do I need to do to? Maybe that. No, next. There you are. There you are. Okay. I'm going to start in a slightly odd place. I'm going to start with the United Nations vote, just to give you the context, and then we're going to go back earlier into history. But just to give you some context, in 1947, at the end of 1947, so 2 years after the Second World War ended, the United Nations, which was then a very young organization, the League of Nations had existed before the war. That had not worked. And then the United Nations was created towards the end of the Second World War. And in November 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution 181, where it was agreed to create two countries. One would be a Jewish state and one would be an Arab state. And so the Jewish state would obviously be occupied and ruled by a Jewish majority, and the Arab state was intended for Palestinians in that area, which today we call Israel and the West Bank. Britain had been given Israel, or not Britain had been given Palestine, the area we're talking about in 1918, 1919, at the end of the war, the First World War, as a mandate. Britain actually occupied Palestine in 1917 as part of the First World War. Britain's occupation of Palestine in 1917 was part of the First World War, as Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, who were on the German side during the First World War. So when Britain occupies Palestine, it's a war aim to dismantle the Ottoman Empire. At the end of the war, the then League of Nations asked Britain to govern, to administer Palestine. And this is what happens from then until 1947, when the United Nations now says it's time to grant these people their own independence. And that decision is made, as I say, on the 29th of November, 1947. And because of the importance of Jerusalem as a city holy to Jews, to Christians, and to Muslims, the United Nations decides it will not work to allow any one country to administer Jerusalem. So there'll be two independent states, one Arab, one Jewish, and then Jerusalem will be under international administration, under the United Nations. That is what is agreed in the General Assembly. It goes to the vote. The United Nations is obviously much smaller than this is before the whole rise of nationalism after the war. 33 countries, 70% vote for, 13 vote against, 10 countries abstain, and one country, Thailand, is not there to vote at all. So it's quite an overwhelming majority, 72% vote to agree to this arrangement. And those supporting the arrangement include Australia, the Philippines, most of South America, France, Canada, USA, and other countries. Those voting against include all the Arab states, Greece and Turkey, and some others. And abstaining are the Republic of China. At that stage, what we now call Taiwan, was the representative. So the Republic of China and the United Kingdom, plus others, abstain. They neither support nor do they vote against it. So by United Nations resolution, it is agreed on two states, what today we would call the two-state solution. This is the map which is presented to the United Nations, not this particular map, but this is what it looks like. The orange bits will be the Jewish state. So all the bits in orange will be under Jewish administration. This will be the new Jewish state. And the bits in yellow will be an Arab state. It's a very awkward arrangement. If you look at, you have the Arab state not joining, and you have the Jewish state not joining. So it's a very awkward arrangement they came up with. But it was based primarily on where there were settled populations. This was largely settled by Jews, and this was largely settled by Arabs. This is mostly desert. This is the Negev desert. And then you see Jerusalem in the middle of the Arab state was going to be this international zone administered by the United Nations. That's the plan. This is what the United Nations agrees upon in November 1947. At the time, as I said already, at the time when this was passed by the United Nations, Palestine, as it was called, had been under British administration since the end of the First World War. Not just Palestine, which I'll show you in a moment. The whole Middle East had actually been divided between a British zone of influence and a French zone of influence. So it wasn't just Britain, wasn't just Palestine under British control. So was Jordan, so was modern-day Iraq, and various other countries, all of which became independent at different times. Britain had been in Palestine since 1917, when General Allenby, as part of the First World War, entered the city. It's very important. This is the photograph of General Allenby entering the old city of Jerusalem on the 11th of December, 1917. And Allenby made a point. When he arrived in Jerusalem, he got off his horse and he walked through the gate. He thought it was very, very important that Britain arrived not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Had he arrived on his horse, there you see a soldier on his horse, but this is General Allenby. Had he arrived riding a horse, he would be like a military man riding in conquest. The British were always very aware of the aesthetics, and so they decided he would arrive on foot. So the local population would not see him as coming as a conqueror, but rather as a liberator from the Ottoman Turks. And the British then set about administering the country, trying to keep both the Arab and the Jewish population happy. It didn't work, but they did try. I can assure you they did try. This was the agreement made actually before the end of the First World War, and later you see affirmed by the League of Nations, of how the Middle East would be divided between British and French control. All this, you see, had been part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire. When the Turks, like the Germans, lost the First World War, this land was taken from them, and these new countries were created: Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. So this is how the map was cut up and agreed upon, ready between the French and the British, with the approval of the League of Nations in 1980, 1919. Prior to the League of Nations giving Britain the mandate to rule over Palestine, already in Britain, the Jewish community had been agitating the British government to support the idea that the Jews should have their own homeland. This is a very important moment. One of you mentions it in your questions. Peng Mingyu, you mentioned that in your question. This is what we know today we call the Belford Declaration. Lord Balfour was the British Foreign Secretary. And in 1917, he sent this letter to Lord Rothschild. The Rothschilds, as you probably know, were and are a very wealthy Jewish family. and the Rothschilds were generally seen as the leaders of British Jewry. And in this letter, you'll see he writes, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you could bring the declaration of the knowledge to the Zionist Federation." We'll talk about Zionism in a moment, but Zionism briefly is a movement that started in the 19th century, promoting the idea that the Jews should have their own homeland, and ideally it should be where the historical Israel was. Zion is another name in the Bible for Jerusalem. So Zion and Jerusalem are the same thing, but Zion actually means the land of Israel, not just Jerusalem. But just to the left, just to the right of this picture is a hill called Mount Zion. If you go to Jerusalem, you'll see there's a hill, which we call Mount Zion. And that is where the word Zion comes from. But let's go back. That's the beginning and the middle of the 20th century. Now let's go back 3,000 years. This is why it's so complicated. The story begins, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story. Those of you who've done the Holocaust course know the story anyway. But the story begins when, at the very beginning of the Jewish story, God speaks to Abraham, and he says to Abraham, "Leave your country, go to a land I will give you, and this land will be yours forever. It will be yours and your descendants forever." And that land is the land of Canaan, which is what today would be Israel, Palestine. And Abraham travels all those many, many miles from today Iraq, Babylon, down to the land of Canaan. And they don't own the land, they don't possess the land. Abraham is a nomad. He moves around the land with his flocks of sheep. And he has a son, remember, Isaac, and Isaac has a son called two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob then has 12 sons. And because of a terrible drought, they go to Egypt, where they spend 430 years. And then you remember, God sends Moses to lead them out of Egypt into the promised land. So this is the land of Canaan, where Abraham lived briefly. And now this is the promised land. And this is where the Jews return. We're talking 3,500 years ago. When they enter the promised land is occupied. There are other people and tribes living there. So they conquer it. God instructs them to conquer it. They fight many battles. And eventually they occupy the promised land, but not all of it. There's an area which even today is called Gaza. It was called Gaza those days already, which is occupied by the Philistines. And the word Palestine comes from the word Philistines. So the Philistines were the other group occupying the land of Canaan. And as I said, the Israelites managed to defeat most of them, but never quite got rid of the Philistines. Philistines remained the enemy for much of the Jewish Bible. This is the country in which the Hebrews or the Israelites live, certainly from about 1,300 BC, so 3,300 years ago, to 586. There are two invasions. This is not important, but just to give you some overview history, there are two invasions, one in 721 BC, when the Assyrians captured 10 of the 12 tribes, and they disappear. We never hear about them again. And then in 586, the Babylonians conquered Judea, and they take the Hebrews into captivity, most, but not all. 70 years later, the Cyrus the Great, the emperor of Persia, he destroys the Babylonians, and he says to the Hebrews or the Israelites, go back to your land, rebuild your temple, and this is what they do. So now, in 70 years after 586, what is that? That's 516, I suppose. They go back and they rebuild their temple, and they settle back in the land of Israel. And there they remain, sometimes under the own authority, sometimes ruled over by occupying powers. This is a map, which I'm sure you've seen before in class, of when the Israelites settled the land of Israel. They settled it according to the 12 tribes of Israel, Asher, Naphtali, blah, blah. The word Jew, remember, comes from Judah. Judah, one of the sons of Jacob. He and the tribe of Benjamin are the only two tribes who really survive the occupation. They're the ones who are taken to Babylon. This is what we call Eretz Israel, okay? This is when Jews speak about Eretz Israel, they mean the land of Israel, which is the land occupied by their ancestors 2,000-3,000 years ago. You'll see it's much bigger than what we call the state of Israel, Medinat Israel. This is the state of Israel today. Yeah, you can see Israel occupies a lot of what today is Jordan. Today, Israel is only to the left, to the west of the River Jordan. In the biblical times, you see it actually extended into what today is Jordan. So there are some Jews today, there are some religious Jews today who feel very strongly that they should, in fact, have access to the biblical land of Israel, Eretz Israel, but I don't think many people take them that seriously. So we're not going to talk too much about that. Let's just focus on the modern state of Israel. After the return from Babylon, the Persians are then defeated by the Greeks, and so Israel, or the Jews, are ruled over by the Greeks. Then there's a rebellion amongst the Jews against the Greeks by Judah Maccabee. They expel the Greeks, and then they rule the country themselves, so it's an autonomous Jewish country, and then it's conquered by the Romans. And then in the year AD 70, 2,000 years ago, more or less, the Jews are expelled from their land, and the vast majority go into exile to North Africa, to Southern Europe, to basically the Roman Empire, and others hang around that area. Some stay in Israel. The area around Jerusalem is mostly clear of Jews, but some Jews go north to the Galilee, and others go just across to Syria, Iran, Iraq, Egypt, those countries today. But this is how, as you all know from class, this is how the Jews lost their country. They're expelled by the Romans. But as I say, they never leave entirely. Certainly the area around Jerusalem they do, but around the Galilee and that, we know from historical sources that there were Jewish settlements which remained there. Very, very importantly, because this is where we get to the really important religious dimension. King David, who lived about 1000 BC, if he lived at all. I mean, nobody can say for certain whether the stories of King David are literally true, historical facts, or merely myth. But the evidence we have is that if he lived about 1000 BC, 3000 years ago, 3021 years ago. And by tradition, by the Bible at least, it's King David who unites the Jewish people. You have the 12 tribes, it's King David who brings the 12 tribes together into united people. And very importantly, he makes Jerusalem the capital. Jerusalem, there was a city called Salem already, which is related to the Hebrew word shalom, peace. So ironically, Jerusalem is, from its name, is the city of peace. Though if you look at the history of Jerusalem, peace is not something one associates with that city. But the important thing is the first temple is built there, not by David, by his son, King Solomon. The temple is destroyed by the Babylonians. When the Israelites or the Jews come back from Babylon, they rebuild the temple slowly. And then in the time of the Romans, or just before the Romans, well, no, during the time of the Romans, under King Herod, the temple is made into this quite extraordinary building, which was considered one of the most magnificent buildings of the time. And this is what we believe it looked like. Please look at this model. Here you see that what today we call the Temple Mount. This is what the temple looked like. Oops, sorry, no, I don't know why that happened. Sorry. This is what it looked like. And this you can see is the city. This is a model, but imagine this is what you'll look at later as the old city of Jerusalem. So completely dominated by the temple. And here is the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple. You can't see it from this side, but where my arrow is over there, if you can think about over that wall, on the back side of the wall is this wall here in the picture behind, what we call the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. So this is what the temple looked like, and very importantly, the temple was the center of Jewish life. All Jews had to go to the temple at least 3 times a year. Wherever they lived in the land, there were certain festivals where they had to go and make sacrifice in the temple. And even those Jews who lived outside Israel, we know many Jews lived in Egypt, in Alexandria, when the Greeks ruled it. Even those Jews living outside the land of Israel had to pay a temple tax of half a shekel. All Jews were obliged to pay this tax of half a shekel, which is what was used to maintain the upkeep of the temple. Once the Romans expel the Jews, not only do they expel the Jews, but they destroy the temple. The temple is burned to the ground, smashed up, destroyed. So this is obviously a major crisis in Jewish life because the temple has been the center of the Jewish religion. Now the Jews have been expelled from their country, and even if they had access to the temple, which they don't because they've been expelled, the temple itself no longer exists. It's gone. So this is really how Judaism as a religion practiced today begins to develop, where rather than go to the temple, you go to local synagogues, etc. But importantly, the temple as an idea remains central to Judaism. And then, and in the 2000 years, since the temple was destroyed by the Romans, even today, when a Jew prays, he or she always prays in the direction of Jerusalem. You can actually buy a little compass called a Jerusalem Finder. You can put the compass on the table and it will show you where Jerusalem is. So when you pray, you know which way to pray. And in Jerusalem, the synagogues, they face the Western Wall. So when you're in Jerusalem, obviously you can't face Jerusalem, you're there, therefore you face where the temple was. And in Jewish prayers, in the prayers religious Jews say 3 times a day, you pray for Jerusalem. So the idea of Jerusalem has been central to Judaism as a religion right from the building of the temple, ever since David made Jerusalem the capital of the Jewish people. Now with the Jews expelled, the Romans officially changed the name of the country to Syria, Palestina. So this is the whole area today, Syria, Israel, Syria, Palestina, becomes the Roman name for what the Jews would have called Israel or Judea, Samaria. And a city is built called Caesarea, named after Caesar. Caesarea is built on the coast, and that really becomes the administrative capital. And Jerusalem is changed to 𝐸𝐴 Capitolina. So the name Jerusalem is also removed by the Romans. And where the temple stood, they now build a temple in which they consecrate to Jupiter, the Roman god, which of course is to desecrate the land where the temple stood, because a statue of a Roman god is absolute anathema in Judaism. So by building a Roman temple where the Jewish temple had stood, the Romans are showing that their religion, their way of life, has replaced Judaism. In the year 312, Constantine, the Roman emperor, converts to Christianity. This is the major moment when suddenly Christianity, this new religion, which is an offshoot of Judaism, and both Judaism and Christianity are repressed by the Romans, but suddenly in the year 312, Constantine himself becomes a Christian, and he sends his mother Helena to the Holy Land, and it's Helena, his mother, who goes around identifying important sites in the Christian story. And it's on her authority, I suppose. She seems to have had visions. It's on her authority that many of the major Christian sites, which are in Israel today, they were identified by her in about 315, 320. Most importantly is what today we call the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was always been called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But Helena, mother of Constantine, she identified this particular spot as where Jesus was both crucified and where he was buried. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is a bit of the interior, and this enormous structure is built over a stone slab, which is believed to be the stone in which Jesus's body was put when he was buried. And today, Christians go there in very large numbers and crawl through that gate there to the stone, which they then kiss, because this is the holiest possible site in Christianity. This church is the center of the Christian religion. The Catholic Church is based, of course, in Rome, but this church, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is the center of Christianity. We don't have time to talk about the church, but it's a very interesting church because it's fought over. Various Christian denominations controlled the church. The Catholics, the Greeks, the Ethiopians, the Armenians, and whatnot, and they're always fighting over who has control over which bit of the church, but that's not relevant to our story. The reason I'm telling you all this is I want you to understand how Jerusalem, never mind the rest of the country, but how Jerusalem has become central to actually all the monotheistic religions. It is the center of Judaism. It is the most important site in Christianity. And as we'll see in a moment, it also becomes enormously important in Islam. This is really the problem, is that Jerusalem is too important to too many people. This is just to give you an idea of the extent of Christianity as a religion. Here you'll see Constantine. So Constantine, he becomes a Christian in 312, and the green and the brown bits are the areas under Roman control when the empire turns Christian. And therefore, very importantly, this area, the Holy Land, Bethlehem, the place where Jesus was born, Jerusalem, the place where Jesus was crucified, these are the most important sites in Christendom. You can see how large the Roman Empire is. And this is the beginning of Christianity as an international religion. Then, however, something drastic happens. Christianity is taken off as a religion, but in the year 632, so about 300 years, 310 years, whatever, after Constantine becomes a Christian, here in the deserts of Arabia, a merchant called Muhammad, has visions in which the archangel Gabriel gives him what becomes known as the Quran, the holy book of Islam. And this new religion rises very dramatically and very quickly, and they immediately set about conquering the land around them. Within Arabia, within this area which was not previously Christian, let's just go back, let's just go back to this map. You'll see this is the Christian Empire. So look at what is Christian, what's not Christian. Once the Muslims take over, once the Muslims rise up, they conquer the land. Where there are people who are not Christian or Jewish, they are forced to convert to Islam. Most of the people in this area would have been polytheists, worshipping statues of different gods. They are forced either become a Muslim or we kill you. When they come across the Christians, and all this area, remember, is Roman Christian, they conquer this land, a lot of this land, and they say to the Christians and the Jews, okay, well, you are people of the book, so we'd rather you became Muslim, but we won't kill you because you believe in the same things we believe. You believe in one God, you believe in many of the things we believe in, so you will live as second-class citizens, but we won't kill you. Well, not all the time anyway. But the important thing I want you to realize, really the point of all this, is this holiest place in Christendom now becomes Muslim. And so, and in the year 636, 637, Jerusalem is occupied by the armies of Islam. And Muslims, this Jerusalem becomes extremely important to Muslims as well. They believe that that site where the Jews had the temple is the site from which Muhammad, on his horse, went from earth to heaven, where there's a point in the Quran where Muhammad goes, he has a night vision, or night journey actually, where he travels to heaven and he meets the prophets, all the previous prophets like Jesus and Moses and whatnot. And because he goes from there to heaven, that site is one of the holiest sites in Islam. Jews and Arabs, you might remember from the Holocaust course, those of you who took it, both believe they descend from Abraham. Jews through Isaac, Arabs through Ishmael. Both claim that when God said, sacrifice your son to me, the Jews say it was Isaac. This is the Muslim story. They say it was Ishmael that had to be sacrificed. But really what I'm trying to say, I suppose, is we have the same stories, the same land, the same stories, the same sites, which are contested between two different religions. The religions are closely related, but the Jews claim these sites and these stories are unique to them, and the Muslims have the same claim. So from the Temple Mount to whose son God said should be sacrificed, was it Ishmael, was it Isaac? And very importantly, on the site of the Temple Mount, where the Jews had their temple, where both the first and the second temple had stood, when the Romans turned Christian and Helena came and identified various sites, for reasons which are not really understood, the Christians actually had very little interest in that site, in that platform where the temple had stood. That was now being used more or less as a rubbish dump by the Christians. When they built the church where Jesus was crucified and buried, that church is somewhere to the left, to the right of your screen. But when the when the Muslims conquered Jerusalem in 637, whatever, they identified the spot where Muhammad went to heaven on his horse, and they built this magnificent gold dome over that. That's called the Dome of the Rock. And next to it, they built this wonderful mosque called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Very, very important sites in Islam. So on the spot, on the site of where the Jewish temple had stood, the first and second temple had stood, and where Jews believe the third temple will be built, is now the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this Temple Mount, this platform, there you can see the Dome of the Rock in shadow. This is the third holiest site in Islam. In Judaism, the very same rock under that golden dome is a rock, and Muslims believe that rock is the rock from which Muhammad went to heaven. Jews believe that rock is the center of the world. It is the very spot where Adam was created by God, and importantly, it is the very rock on which God was told, and God told Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, or if you are Muslim, sacrifice his son Ishmael. So as you can see, this particular site, what Jews call the Temple Mount, what Muslims call the Haram al-Sharif, is the most holy place, and it is also the most hotly contested piece of land in the world. It's not very big, but my God, it is the cause of untold tension between religions. From the time of the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem, building the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, 451 years pass, when the Christians in Europe say, hang on, our holy city, the city where Jesus lived and died, is under the control of Muslims. We have to take the city back. You have the First Crusade, which we talked about if you did the Holocaust class. The Christian armies, the Crusades, they go across Europe, they arrive in Jerusalem, they attack the city, they conquer the city, and they kill thousands and thousands of Muslims and Jews. This is important. If you read the sources, most of those sources will say the Crusaders attacked the city was bravely defended by Muslims and Jews. So we know there were Jews living in the city with Muslims. Yes, it was a majority Muslim city, but Jews having been expelled 1,000 years earlier by the Romans, some Jews had moved back and were also living in Jerusalem, and both defended the city against the Christians, and both were killed in very large numbers. The Christians immediately desecrated the Muslim sites. The mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was turned into a stables for the Crusaders' horses, and the Dome of the Rock, that had a cross put on top of it and turned into something like a church. This is what it looks like today. So now you can see it more clearly. This is the Dome of the Rock, built above the stone, which Muslims believe is the site from where Muhammad went to heaven, and which Jews believe was the site of where Abraham was going to sacrifice his son Isaac, and is the center of the world. And this is the site where the temple stood, that wonderful Jewish temple. This is where it stood. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest mosque in Islam, after the mosque in Mecca and the mosque in Medina. And if you look where, no, it's the wrong side. You can't see the western wall from here. The western wall is actually over there somewhere. Nonetheless, this gives you a very beautiful view of what Jews call the Temple Mount and Muslims call the Haram al-Sharif, this platform built up. So you can see it obviously was a hill which King Herod or somebody before flattened and made into this extraordinary platform, which has become so important as a religious site. This is the rock underneath the dome of the rock. So here's the dome. You can see this is the interior of the dome looking up, and this is the dome covering this rock, which is so holy. And now you can see the western wall. This was never part of the temple. This was merely a supporting wall. The temple stood over here, but this is all that remains. And so for today, and for the last 2,000 years, this has been the holiest site in Judaism. Very religious Jews will not go up to the Temple Mount because we don't know where the Holy of Holies was. If you remember that picture of the temple, there was this one area called the Holy of Holies where no one was allowed to stand, only God could be there. And so religious Jews won't go up there in case they stand on a spot, which was the Holy of Holies. But tourists can go up there and have a look around sometimes, not always, sometimes it's closed, but you can normally go up. And this bit here is where Jews go to pray. This is the Western Wall. So this whole site is hotly contested. And this just gives you a sense of when we say Jerusalem, we're actually talking about the old city, which is this bit. You can just see the walls, the city walls, and the area is the Temple Mount with the golden rock. This is modern Jerusalem. This bit beyond the walls is East Jerusalem, which is largely occupied by Arabs today, and this is West Jerusalem, which is largely lived in by Jews. So this is Arab Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, this is West Jerusalem, and this is the old city of Jerusalem. And there you can get a sense of old Jerusalem, the old city. This is known as the Jewish Quarter, the Muslim Quarter, the Christian Quarter, and the Armenian Quarter. The Armenians are Christians. I'm not sure why they labeled separately, but Armenians have lived here for a very, very long time. But this is what the old city looks like today. And here is the Temple Mount, here is the Western Wall, here is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, etc. Okay, from 1187, 1284, more crusades, but finally the Christians lose control of Jerusalem and the Muslims take it back, Islam takes it back, and it remains under the control of Islam until 1917, when the British, under General Allenby, enter and liberate it from the Ottomans. From 1516, I mean, all the time there are different Muslim powers. We don't have time to go into the history of Islam, but Islam is never a united religion. Yes, the religion is an international religion, but various rulers, sometimes from Syria, sometimes from Iraq, sometimes from Egypt, are conquering the empire. And so you have different styles of Islam, different Islamic rulers. And from 1516, this area is part of the Turkish or Ottoman Empire. This is the extent of the Ottoman Empire. And they rule, the Turks rule this from 1516 all the way through to 1917, when the British take it from the Turks. So from the time of the Jews losing their country in AD 70, up to 1947, Resolution 181, United Nations, this area, Israel, Palestine, has been Roman, it's been Christian, it's been Muslim, it's been Christian, it's been Muslim, it's been Christian. After 1917, the British will say are Christian. So it's constantly changed hands. But the point I want to make is that for 2,000 years, there never was a country called Israel, nor was there a country called Palestine. The area was called Palestine by the Romans, but there was never a country, a state called Palestine. There was a geographical area called Palestine, but never a country. And Israel had ceased to exist long, long time ago as well. So this is merely a geographical area under the domination of various powers, sometimes Muslim, sometimes Christian. And then in 1918, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, as we saw earlier, this area's future is largely determined by the French and the British. Now, to change tack slightly. Throughout the 2,000 years that the Jews have not had a country, and we're living mostly in Europe or the Middle East or North Africa, there were always some Jews who would go back to the Holy Land. One of the most famous Jews in history is a man called Moses Maimonides. He was born in Spain. He's one of the most important figures in Jewish philosophy and Jewish religious law. He lives in Spain. There's a persecution by the Muslims against the Jews in Spain. So he and his family flee to Morocco and they flee to Egypt. And he dies, I forget, maybe 1071 or so. I forget when he dies, but in the 11th century he dies. But he wants to be buried in the Holy Land. So his body is taken to Tiberias and buried in the Holy Land. So even Jews who were living abroad, many, when they could, would visit Jerusalem, would come to this Western Wall and pray. Some would go and live in Israel, or live in Palestine, rather, the area is called Palestine, would go and live there. But it is, without doubt, a dominantly Muslim area. It's part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which is a Muslim empire. But Jews are living there in small numbers. In the 19th century, the longing to live in the Holy Land, to live in Palestine, becomes not just a religious longing, but also a political longing. And there's a man called Theodor Herzl, who was born in Hungary in 1860, and he is seen as the father of what we call Zionism. Zionism is a political movement which believes that Jews have the right to a homeland. Because until now, Jews are living simply as guests in various countries around the world, and therefore Jews are constantly being persecuted, they're being killed, they have no country they can call their own. And in the late 19th century, Theodor Herzl, he takes this longing to go back to the country, back to Palestine. He turns it into a political movement, which becomes known as Zionism. And he then sets about trying to influence powerful people to make it a reality. He goes to Turkey, he goes to the Ottoman Empire, he tries to meet the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, he tries to persuade the Sultan to allow a part of Palestine to be settled in perpetuity by Jews. The Sultan doesn't agree, but he does agree to sell land to the Jews. And so Herzl and others approach wealthy Jews like the Rothschilds and others now to buy land in the Ottoman Empire in Palestine. And so land is being bought in Palestine by wealthy Jews. Money is being raised in Jewish homes and sent to a central administration so the money together can buy land. And this is all part of the plan of resettling the Holy Land, the land of Israel, call it what you want to, by Jews. Herzl, as I say, he approached the Sultan when the German Kaiser Wilhelm II went on a tour of Palestine. Herzl, this is Herzl over here with the big beard. Herzl doesn't go with him, but he goes at the same time so he can meet him. And he tries to persuade the Kaiser to become a champion, and the Kaiser agrees to support the idea of a Jewish homeland. In 1894, there's a trial in Paris of a Jew who's falsely accused of being a traitor. During the trial, the French were supposed to be a highly civilized people, take to the streets and shout, "Death to the Jews, death to the Jews." For Herzl, this is evidence of how important it is for the Jews to have a homeland. He writes a number of books and pamphlets. One is called the Judenstadt, the Jewish state. Another one is called the Alt-Neuland, the old new land. This was our land biblically, it will be our land again. And he starts this organization this movement called Zionism. They have their first Congress, the World Jewish Congress meets in Switzerland in 1897, where they discuss the idea of setting up a Jewish homeland, and they approach the wealthy Jewish families, like the Rothschilds, the Montefiore's and others, to raise money towards this end. So now there's an active move to encourage Jews to move to the land of Palestine, the biblical land of Israel. Just want to give you an idea of what the population was like in the early 20th century. When at the end of the First World War, Britain takes possession of the land, this is the population. There are about 84,000 Jews living there. There are 71,000 Christians and 589,000 Muslims. Most of the Christians would have been Muslim and would have been Arab. Most of the Christians would have been Arab. So when we say Christians, Christians and Muslims together would have been the Arab population. So you will see significantly more. The Jewish population is slightly more than 10% if you add those two together. In 1931, you have 175,000 Jews, and you have 89,000 Christians, 760,000 Muslims. 1947, when you have the two states being declared, you have 630,000 Jews, 147,000 Christians, 1,181,000 Muslims, roughly. So, but today, or 2 years ago, 2019, at least in that bit which is Israel, not the West Bank, we have 6,770,000. No, sorry, we have 6,772,000. So that should be. Oh, sorry, that needs a few zeros in it. I missed those. Oh yeah. Just to get an idea of the population. Today's population in Israel is about 9.3 million. 74% of them are Jewish, 18% is Muslim, and the others are made up of Christians, Druze, and other minorities. In that bit, which is called the Palestinian territories, which is 99.7% Muslim, the population is about 5.3 million. So if there was one state, not a two-state, if there was one state, we'd be looking at a population of close to 15 million, making up that. Interwar Palestine, the Jews. This beautiful picture over here. This is Jaffa, one of the oldest ports in the world. This existed in biblical times. Those of you who know the story about Jonah and the whale, remember the whale eats Jonah. Jonah sails off from Jaffa. When the Jews begin to settle in the land in Palestine, They settle inside Jaffa, but it becomes too crowded. Those days, this was a walled city, and they move out and start their own settlement in 1909, and that is Tel Aviv, this very modern city, which is only 100 years old, just over 110 years old, but it's a magnificent modern city, and it's very much a Jewish city. So in the land of Palestine, Jews are now building their own settlements. Rishon LeZion is probably the first, mostly Russian immigrants. Herzliya, Netanya, Tel Aviv, various towns and cities are being built. When the Jews settle in the land in Palestine in the 19th and early 20th century, most of them are socialist politically. And by no means all, but the majority belong to things we call kibbutz or kibbutzim, which is socialism in practice. It's an idea that you all live together in a community. You all work according to your talents, and you all earn the same amount of money. There's no, everybody does what they can do. So somebody's a school teacher, somebody plants trees, somebody waters the trees, somebody looks after the children, somebody's a doctor, somebody's a nurse. You live in these communities. And the success of the Israeli or the Jews in Palestine story is partly the system of kibbutzim and moshavim. Moshav is similar to kibbutz, but slightly looser arrangement, where they do literally turn the desert into a garden. All the pictures I'm showing you now were in fact desert. And then these Jewish settlers settled there with great hardship. Many died from malaria and other diseases. But over the years, they managed to make the desert bloom. And even today, Israel is known for its extraordinary prowess in water technology and reclaiming the desert, etc. And Jaffa, that beautiful city I showed you a moment ago, was famous for its oranges, and so developing orchards, etc., was all part of this Jewish endeavor to settle the land, which from an Arab point of view is a form of colonialism. But for Jews, it was simply returning to their homeland. With the increased Jewish settlement from the 19th and early 20th century in Palestine, there was increased tension between the small Jewish population and the much larger Arab population. And there were various attacks on Jews. The worst was in 1929, when in Jerusalem, 133 Jews were killed. In Hebron, in Hebron, Jews were killed. So Britain, which was now ruling the territory, had to intervene. The British police and British army had to try and keep control, keep the Jews and the Arabs away from each other. And in the 1930s, there was even more tension between the Jews and the Arabs. And with the deteriorating situation in Europe, 1930s, Hitler comes to power in 1933, Jews have nowhere to go. America says, no, you can't come here. Britain says, no, you can't come here. So Jews, the only place they think they can go to is Palestine. But because there are more and more Jews going to Palestine, the Arabs protest and persuade the British government to stop allowing Jews. And so in 1939, the British government publishes what is known as a white paper, goes through Parliament, in which Jewish immigration to Palestine is restricted to 75,000 over the next 5 years. And then it's agreed that after the 5 years lapses, the local Arab population, which is the majority, will then decide whether more Jews will be allowed to immigrate, and in what sort of numbers. But note the date, it's 1939. The Second World War breaks out. Jews are trapped in Europe, and Jews cannot go to Palestine. There's a white paper forbidding emigration to Palestine. Tremendous pressure is put on the British government in London to withdraw the white paper, to allow increased emigration to Palestine, but Britain refuses. And this remains a sore point with Jews, that had Britain wavered the white paper, more Jews would have left Europe and settled in Palestine rather than be killed in the camps in Europe. But this is the situation. And then there's also the important point that various Arab states, especially places like Iraq, Syria, were very pro-Nazi during the war. And the Mufti of Jerusalem, this is the Muslim leader in Jerusalem, he encouraged Hitler, and he even encouraged these are European Muslims from Bosnia. Yeah, you have the Grand Mufti. He encouraged Muslims in Bosnia to enlist and serve alongside the German army. So from an historical point of view, during the war, Britain did nothing to help the Jews escape to Palestine. And the Islamic leader, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, he actually was an active supporter of Hitler. Yeah, he's meeting Hitler in Berlin, and yeah, he's inspecting the Muslim troops who were fighting alongside the Germans, which obviously left a bitter taste in people's mouths. Okay, now we're getting back to where we started. We're back in 1947. We're back with Resolution 181. The United Nations declares a two-state solution. Nothing very much happens, but in that resolution of 1947, 181, the United Nations says they have about 10 months to create these two states, by which time Britain will then withdraw, and Britain will no longer be there to maintain order. On the 14th of May, 1948, Israel declares independence. David Ben-Gurion is the prime minister. It's at this point that they decide on the name Israel. Until this point, there's much debate. What do they call the new country? Judea, Herzliya, all sorts of names are suggested. But it's at this point they decide that the new country is going to be called Israel. Ben-Gurion, this is where it all gets very murky, and where one has to try and be as open-minded and as honest as possible. The Jews agreed with the United Nations to create a state. The Arabs rejected it. When independence is declared on the 14th of May, 1948, the very next day, the newborn Jewish state is attacked by various Arab armies. They try to murder the new state at birth, strangle it at birth. Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, and Iraq all attack this little country, Israel. The war, before this, before these countries attack Israel, in the lead up to independence, in that time in 1947, when Britain wants to get out, the United Nations says two states, there's already a simmering civil war between the Jews and the Arabs. When the Jews declare independence, the Arabs attack. And that war goes on for close to over a year, actually. It goes on, I think, until July 1949, so about 14 months. While the war is still in progress, on the 11th of May 1949, Israel is admitted as a full member of the United Nations. So Israel is widely, not universally, but widely acknowledged as an independent sovereign state. Some countries, the Arab countries, do not accept it, but a majority in the UN allow Israel to join as an independent sovereign state. In that war, Israel succeeds in extending the territory, which was more than there was in that Palestinian map drawn up by the United Nations. But they also lost some territory to the Arab armies. They gained some territory. But now a very important point is, remember, the United Nations said that Jerusalem would be under United Nations administration. At the end of the war in 1949, the old city of Jerusalem is under Jordanian control, Arab control, not under United Nations control. And the Arabs do not allow the Jews into the old city of Jerusalem. So from 1948 to 1967, no Jew can go into the old city to pray at the Western Wall. There's a hill, as I mentioned earlier, Mount Zion, just outside. Jews would go to Mount Zion and they could see over the wall, over the city wall to this Western Wall, and that was the closest they could get to it. Jordan annexed all the other bits of what was supposed to be the state of Palestine. So the point I'm trying to make is that even after the 1948-49 war, when you had the creation of the state of Israel, there was no country called Palestine. The Arabs rejected the idea of a Palestinian country. And when the war ended in 1949, that land, which should have been the state of Palestine, was annexed by Jordan. So now you have Israel bordering Jordan, and Egypt takes control of the Gaza Strip. And this is what we're looking at. Well, this map is not very good. This is just a map of the war, of the attacks from the different Arab countries. Let's rather look at this map. Okay, please spend a moment to look at this. This is the United Nations plan. The blue bits are the Jewish bits, the brown bits are the Arab bits, and the pink bit is international territory, Jerusalem. The Arabs invade, and after Israel has fought back, this is more or less what I think there's another map. Let me just see. Yeah, now we can see what it looks like after 1948. This is now the Jewish territory. Oh, bugger. Sorry, why does it keep doing this? This is what it looks like in 48. Now you can see there is no Palestine. No Palestine. This is all Jordan. This is the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. This is the state of Israel. Egypt has occupied what is known as Gaza. Jordan has occupied all this bit and this bit. You see, this bit was supposed to be Arab territory, but the Jews in that war of independence claimed this bit, 𝐚𝐸 and up towards the Lebanese border. No Palestine. Palestine does not exist. In 1948, when you have the war of independence in Israel or Palestine, call it what you want, in the Arab world, in protest at the creation of the state of Israel, the Arab countries expel their Jewish populations, approximately 800,000 Jews who have lived in these Arab countries for 2,000 years. In some cases, in the case of Iraq, for 3,000 years, are expelled. So about 800,000 Jews are left homeless. The vast majority flee to the land of Israel. So Israel now has to absorb 800,000, mostly Middle Eastern Jews, whose first language is usually Arabic. They've lived in Egypt, in Morocco, in Iraq, in Syria, with the Arab majority. So while they are Jews and they read and pray in Hebrew, their first language is Arabic. They flee to the newly created state of Israel. Mostly, some go to America and France and elsewhere, but most go to Israel. And at the same time, in the fighting in Palestine, Israel, many of the Arabs living there are expelled, and this is where it gets very tricky. Some Jewish books would try and persuade you that all the Arabs left of their own accord. That is not true. It's certainly true in some cases that Arab leaders said to the Arab population, leave, when we conquer, when we throw the Jews out, you can come back. That certainly happened. But we must be honest from a Jewish point of view that there were many situations where the Jewish settlers actively expelled the Arabs. And so at the end of the 1949 war, you have a situation where 800,000 Jews have been expelled from the Middle East and other Arab countries, and you have about 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 Arabs who've lost their homes in what was Palestine, now under Jewish authority. And this remains a very important issue, which we'll get onto later, which is the refugee crisis. Those Arabs who flee from their homes in the new Jewish state, they go mostly to Jordan. Remember, Jordan is now where Palestine should be. They go to Lebanon. They go to other Arab countries. As I said, between 1948 and 1967, Israel has no access to the old city of Jerusalem, which is now under Jordanian control. And the Jewish quarter in the old city is largely destroyed by the Arabs. Synagogues are burnt to the ground, graves are destroyed on the Mount of Olives, various things. And after the war, we have what is called the Green Line, which demarcates the different bits. There you see, this is West Jerusalem controlled by the Jews. All the pink bit is Jordanian territory. And the old city, even though it's supposed to be under international control, is actually entirely under Jordanian control. Mount Scopus is where the Hebrew University is, and that remains under Jewish control, though not much good, but it's cut off from the rest of the Jewish state. And yeah, you can see the line between West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem as it looked in 1948-49 after the war. In 1956, France and Britain encouraged Israel as an ally to participate in a stupid plan to prevent Nasser, General Nasser, the ruler of Egypt, from nationalizing and completely controlling the Suez Canal. This is known as the Suez Crisis. It's not important here, other than this was when America asserted its power against Britain and France, and they had to withdraw. But part of that crisis was caused by General Nasser closing the Straits of Tehran. This is the Straits of Tehran. If you look at this map, there you see a little place called Eilat, which is in Israel. This is Egypt, this is Saudi Arabia, this is Jordan, this is Israel. Israel has ports over there, and it has a very important port in Eilat. The Arabs closed the strait, preventing Jewish shipping, Israeli shipping. And that became the excuse for the French and the British to attack Egypt. It was a disaster. In 1967, Nasser still the ruler of Egypt, he now sends the Egyptian navy, and again, they close the Straits of Tehran so that Israeli shipping cannot use this international channel. This is a cause for war, a casus belli. This led to increased tension, and Egypt got onto a war footing, and Israel got onto a war footing. And given that under international law, by closing the Straits, Egypt was, in a sense, declaring war on Israel without actually firing a shot, the Israelis took the initiative, if you like, and the Israeli Air Force attacked and bombed the Egyptian airfields, and so completely destroyed the Egyptian Air Force. So when war broke out the next day, Israel was attacked by Egyptian armies, by Jordanian armies, by Iraqi armies. This is known as the Six-Day War. And this was a moment of absolute crisis. This is when Israel came very close to not existing. This, for many Israelis, this was going to be the Holocaust all over again. Yeah, you have these Arab armies all attacking Israel. And for many Israelis, for many Jews who had not been religious beforehand, the fact that in 6 days, only 6 days, Israel not only pushed back the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Iraqis, everybody else, they actually pushed them back and extended their territory. So this is the beginning of the difficult bit, because now, having extended their territory, Israel destroyed the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Iraq was involved in a slightly minor way. Israel now captures the city of Jerusalem. Now the old city is in Jewish hands after first time Jews can go there since 1948. The Golan Heights between Syria and Israel is captured by Israel. And that bit, which should have been the Palestinian state, which was under Jordanian control, is now captured by the Israelis, as is the Gaza Strip, which was previously controlled by Egypt. And this is what we call the West Bank. This is where this bit along the Jordan River, which should have been the state of Palestine, was Jordan from 1948 until now, is now for the first time all under Israeli control. The Israelis won an extraordinary victory. Because for many Jews, this was, if they weren't religious before, this was a cause to become religious, because it was, for many Jews, a miracle that they not only survived, but defeated the Arab armies. But in many ways, this was also the beginning of the problem, because now Israel was in control of land, which was, in 1947, the United Nations said should be an independent Palestine. Now they controlled these territories. There were many Israelis in government who said, we should not control them, we must hand them back to the Jordanians or the Palestinians. Others in the Israeli government said, no, we need to control them as a security measure. We will go to war at any time again with our Arab neighbors. We need to control as much land as we can. And that is how, from 1967 onwards, what today we call the West Bank and Gaza came under, in one way or another, Jewish control. Oops, sorry, wrong one. Next. Then probably, I think having won so decisively the 1967 war, perhaps the Israelis became a bit complacent. Having won the war so decisively, I think Israel became comfortable in its military might. And so we're caught completely by surprise in 1973 on Yom Kippur. Remember, Yom Kippur is the holiest day in Judaism. It's the day when Jews don't eat any food or drink any water. On that day, I mean, there were possibilities of war, but the Israeli intelligence said no, the Arabs are not going to attack, we're safe as it is. And then on Yom Kippur, when most Jews were fasting, Egypt and Syria simultaneously attacked Israel. And then various other Arab armies. The principal fighters were the Egyptians, the Syrians, but then also the Jordanians, the Saudi Arabians, Iraqis, Libyans, Kuwaitis, Tunisians, other expeditionary forces from Arab countries joined in and attacked Israel. In many ways, this was part of the Cold War because the major backer in terms of military power was the USSR. They were supporting the Arab states, and the United States was Israel's main backer. So in many ways, this was actually a proxy war between the USSR, Russia, and the USA. Initially, the war went very, very badly for Israel. A very high casualty rate. Plans were made to dig mass graves in public parks in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv because Israel feared that so many people were going to be killed. Yet again, Israel rallied, and having been caught on the back foot and having done very badly initially, after a few days, Israel managed to push back and managed to actually enter Egypt and approach Cairo, the Egyptian capital, enter Syria and approach Damascus. And it was at this point, because of the Russian involvement, that the Americans became fully involved and demanded that Israel stop fighting, because there was a fear that if Israel captured Syria or Egypt, the Russians would then intervene with their own forces, which would lead to a war between Russia and America. So the Americans insisted on a ceasefire, which left, I mean, this war left Israel very shaken. The death rate, the casualty rate was much higher. 3,000 plus Israeli soldiers were killed in the 2 or 3 weeks of the war. It's a very high number. We're only a country of a few, at that stage, maybe just 2 million. 3,000 to die is a high number. This, in fact, is one of my first political memories, and I have other memories, but I was 8 years old, and I remember this war very, very well, listening to it on the radio every day with great anxiety. So the situation at the end of the war is that Israel is still in control of the Golan Heights, it's still in control of the West Bank, and now it also controls the Sinai Desert, which was Egyptian. So Israel, even though it did initially very badly in the war, ultimately emerged as probably stronger than beforehand. And certainly the Palestinian position is no better off. It's important to point out, just jumping back slightly, that really in 1964 already, so before the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, the Palestinians had started an organization with Arab backing called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, under a man called, what's his name? Yasser Arafat, who were the representatives of the Palestinians. The Palestinian cause, Palestinian independence, now became a major international cause. And under the PLO, there were attempts to get the United Nations and other international bodies to support actively work on behalf of the Palestinians. Because the Palestinians were not succeeding, this is really the beginnings of Palestinian terrorism, which from a Jewish point of view did nothing to advance their cause. There were numerous hijackings. The airport was attacked. 30 people were killed. Palestinians entered the airport and mowed down lots of people. You might remember, you might know, you won't remember, you weren't born. But in 1972, many members of the Israeli Olympic team were held hostage and were killed. There was the Entebbe hijacking. There were various threats to Israeli security, which it's complicated. On the one hand, you understand the Palestinian frustration. The Palestinians are no closer to a homeland than they were ever. But from an Israeli point of view, killings either overseas, whether the Munich Olympics or Entebbe, or later in 1994, this bombing in Buenos Aires, where 80 people were killed, does nothing to encourage the Israelis to negotiate with the Palestinians. And so you really reach the stalemate where the Palestinians are becoming more and more frustrated, and the Israeli side is becoming more and more entrenched, and with both sides making demands of the other. You have to renounce violence or we won't talk to you. Why should we talk to you? Why should we renounce violence when you haven't talked to us before? And so you reach this sort of stalemate between the two sides. It got particularly bad in what is called the First and Second Intifada. These were general uprisings in Israel and in the Palestinian territories, where there were numerous suicide bombings. And about 4,000 Israelis have been killed in terrorist bombings since 1948. There have been numerous accords, attempts to reach peace, not all dealing specifically with the Palestinian cause, though the Palestinian is always at the heart of the matter. The most successful, though it didn't do much to advance the Palestinian cause, was the Camp David Agreement of 1978. Israel had captured a lot of Egyptian territory in the previous wars. In 1978, under President Carter in America, the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, no, the Egyptian side, not the Egyptians and the Israelis made a peace agreement that if Israel handed back territory to the Sinai Peninsula, if they gave it back to Egypt, Egypt would, for the first time, recognize Israel's right to exist. No other Arab state agreed with this. Egypt was the first Arab state to recognize that Israel had a right to exist. Later, there was the Madrid Conference, which didn't produce anything of substance. The Oslo Accords were important because Israel, in the Oslo Accords, forced the PLO, to change their constitution. The PLO's charter or constitution did not allow for the existence of a Jewish state. The Israelis said, well, we can't talk to you. If you don't allow for the existence of a Jewish state, there's no point in talking. So the Oslo Accords led to the PLO changing their constitution and largely becoming less of a armed organization committing acts of terrorism to a political organization with whom the Israelis could negotiate. Various agreements were made, which we could argue how they've been fulfilled. The Palestinians would say the Israelis haven't sufficiently fulfilled them. The Israelis would say, well, the Palestinians haven't sufficiently fulfilled their side. It goes on and on. In 1994, very importantly, Israel and Jordan signed a peace agreement. They are the second Arab country to recognize Israel as a legitimate state with the right to exist. In 2000, it's probably the closest we've come to a peace agreement. Unfortunately, nobody can actually agree what was agreed or not agreed at Camp David 2000. Essentially, the Palestinians and the Israelis got together and came up with a policy that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. At the end of which, the Palestinians were not happy with the Israeli offer, and so nothing came of that. Though the Israelis say they were very generous, the Arabs or the Palestinians say they were not generous enough. So nothing came of that. Most recently, we've had the Abraham Accords, which are good for Israel. The Abraham Accords, as you might remember, were signed only last year, where a number of Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and even Morocco now recognize Israel's right to exist. But they don't actually do anything for the Palestinian cause. There is a sense, I think, amongst Palestinians that the Arab world is caring less and less and less about them. Arab countries are concerned about other Middle Eastern problems, particularly the incredibly growing influence of Iran. Iran is not an Arab state, it's a Muslim state, but not an Arab state. Iran is seen as a major threat to stability in the Middle East. And so increasingly, Arab states are willing to make peace with Israel, but in making peace with the Israelis are not doing anything to advance the Palestinian cause. In the Camp David Accord, in the Camp David meeting of 2000, was not 2000, was 2000, and in the Oslo Accords, and in all the other accords, these are the stumbling blocks. These are the things that neither party can agree on. One of which is the status of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, the Ham al-Sharif, the thing I've been talking about again and again, this picture you see on the slide behind you. Extremely important to Muslims, extremely important to Jews. Who controls it? Under the present arrangement, the temple, what the Jews call the Temple Mount, what Arabs call Haram al-Sharif, it's Muslim, it's under the control of the Waqf, under Muslim control, and Jordan, the king of Jordan, is the guardian. That is an arrangement which seems to be working, but Israel demands the right to have sovereignty over it. They will allow the Jordanians to administer it, but it should be under, as it is at the moment, under Israeli control. This is something Israel is not willing to give up. This is something the Palestinians are not willing to accept. Very important is the right of return. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced in 1948. Many of them went to Jordan, Lebanon, elsewhere, Kuwait. It has to be admitted, even if people might deny it, it has to be admitted that the Arab countries have done nothing to absorb that Palestinian population. They remain 70 years later living in refugee camps. The Palestinians in Kuwait, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, do not have the same rights as Arabs in those countries. They're still recognized or considered as refugees. Israel's argument is 800,000 Jews were displaced in the Middle East. We've taken Jews. This is the land of, Israel is the country of Jews. If we allow 600,000, 700,000 or any number of Palestinians back into Israel, it will threaten the Jewish majority. Israel will no longer be a Jewish majority state. So that, for both sides, is a non-negotiable. Neither side can agree on what to do about that. There's much discussion about, from 67, but particularly later, now, and the last 20 years, Israel has been settling land in the West Bank, which is Palestinian land. In Israel, you had a change in government. Israel was under a Labour left-wing government until the 1980s. Since then, has largely been under a right-wing government. And under the right-wing government, there's been increasing movement towards settling in what should be Palestinian territory. And under international law, this is seen as illegal, and it probably is illegal. And Israel and the Palestinians have to negotiate, well, if this area is now so settled by Jewish settlers, Israel needs to compensate the Palestinians for land lost, and is something they can't agree upon. And then there's a security issue. Given that Israel has been attacked by Arab armies variously, sees the Arab world as its enemy, even if Palestine becomes an independent country, Israel insists that it have a security presence there. And the Palestinians say, absolutely not. If we're an independent country, we cannot have Israeli troops in our territory. So none of this can be agreed upon. And these are the sticking points. In all the talks which they have, these four are the major sticking points. Another one is the Golan Heights. Israel occupied the Golan Heights in 1967, entrenched their position in 1973. Syria demands it back. So it doesn't really have to do with the Palestinian situation, but Syria will not recognize Israel until the Golan Heights are returned. Israel says there's no way they'll return the Golan Heights because it is a major, it's difficult to explain, but if you go to the Golan Heights, gosh, okay, I didn't realize we're talking so long, sorry. If you go to the Golan Heights, it does overlook Israel. So it would give the Assyrians a major advantage militarily. So these are all the stumbling blocks. Let me just move on. I'm sorry, I didn't realize how long I've been yakking on. It's important to emphasize that in 2005, for instance, now people might attack me for this, but this is true. In 2005, to everybody's surprise, a very right-wing prime minister, Ariel Sharon, surprised Israel, surprised the world, when he said Israel is withdrawing from Gaza. There were many Jewish settlements in Gaza. Those settlers were forcibly removed by the Israeli army. They were taken out kicking and screaming by the Israeli army. Gaza was given back to the Palestinians under Palestinian rule. In Gaza, the settlers were growing vegetables in modern high-tech greenhouses, etc., etc. Once Gaza was returned to Palestinian rule, Gaza began to launch rockets and missiles onto Israeli territory. And this is what the recent wars have been about. That Israel evacuated from Gaza, and since then, a Palestinian organization called Hamas, one of you asked me about Hamas, we'll talk about Hamas in a moment, a Palestinian organization called Hamas, which is Islamicist in its view of the view of the land, that the land is Islamic land and must be turned into an Islamic caliphate. They control Gaza. The Palestinian Authority, PLO, now Fatah, control the West Bank. So you have two Palestinian organizations who are arch enemies of each other, Gaza under Hamas, West Bank under Fatah, and in Gaza, the people, they're much more attacked. Hamas militantly refusing to recognize Israel's right to exist. If we have a moment, I want to just show you in a moment. I want to show you some extracts from Hamas's constitution, just give you an idea of what I mean. Iran, Saudi Arabia are enemies, according to instability in the Middle East, which makes the Palestinian cause less important to the Arab states. Qatar is a major supporter of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Can we resolve the situation? I have no idea. This is what we're looking for. We're hoping one day to reach a peace accord where Israel and that Palestine can exist as a country. The options are the two-state solution, one Israel next to a separate independent Palestine, of which these are the stumbling blocks: the state of Jerusalem, right of return, etc., etc. Until that can be agreed upon, who knows whether we can have two states. The other solution is what is the one-state solution, where Israel, Palestine become one country. But for most Jews, that is not acceptable, because that would mean an Arab majority, and therefore the Jews will not have a country they can call uniquely their own. I want to emphasize something which I think people do not sufficiently understand. One of the reasons Israeli Jews are so vehement about this is because of the Holocaust. Don't forget that Jews had nowhere to go in the Holocaust. Israel is the only country Jews can call their own. There's no way Jews are going to relinquish their majority in a country, because there's always the possibility of Holocaust again. From a Palestinian point of view, they say, why should we, the Palestinians, pay the price for what the Germans did to the Jews? Why should we, the Palestinians, lose our land because the Germans killed the Jews? We are not going to be the penalty of the Holocaust. Both sides are equally right. When both sides are equally right, whether it's about control of the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, whether it's about whether Jews have a right to the homeland given the Holocaust, or whether the Palestinians should pay the price, both sides are right. And when both sides are right, you have no solution. And that is why I say it is mission impossible. I cannot see how, when both sides have right on their side, I don't see how you can have a solution.